introduce our speaker today.
Okay, thank you. Since my retirement, I've always been an advocate of lifelong learning. And I was fortunate that about, 12 years ago, I started taking courses with Dr. Stern. Uh, Mark has a distinguished background. Has a doctorate in political science, taught at a number of universities, including the University of Missouri St. Louis. And then he became a provost in a university in West Virginia. Fortunately for me, he and his wife moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. And as I say, over the last probably 12 years or so, every year I take several courses with Mark. Uh, they've included everything from the presidents, the background of all of our presidents and what they've done, immigration, current events. And right now I'm taking a course with him on China. And I asked him to speak to our group. And today he's going to talk to us about China's 100 years of humiliation. So, Mark, why don't I turn it over to you now?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Judith, for your great help in putting this together.
You're
And
welcome.
thank you, Harvey, for uh, being my friend and student. It's always wonderful to have lunches with you, as well as have you in classes with us. Um, as Harvey mentioned, I taught at Missouri St. Louis as my very first job after receiving my doctorate. Lived in Creve Coeur, so I'm familiar with your environs. And I'm delighted to be here in Scottsdale and not in Creve Coeur right now, because over here it's going to be in the 70s and sunny today. And I have no doubt your weather will be a little different than ours on the colder side.
That's good. Appreciate
Uh,
it.
I, the 100 years of humiliation is really a portal into understanding today's China. And before I get us there, I want to make absolutely unequivocal statements about what China is or isn't. Um, right now, under Xi, it is probably the most centralized totalitarian state that's ever occurred in modern history. It beats Nazi Germany by a mile. And Xi has been a one-man dictator. Prior to Xi, Deng had a collegial governance structure. And that had lasted from 1978 until Xi came into power. Xi really changed things. So I'm under no mistaken beliefs about what China is or is not. On the other hand, what I believe that is currently going on in China now about Hong Kong and Taiwan is part of China's history and part of China's basic belief system, that whether it would be a communist government in charge or a democratic government, the push would be to move to retake Hong Kong and Taiwan and bring them back to the motherland, as they call it. So that's my belief and how I understand all of this. I think both Hong Kong and Taiwan are an integral part of Chinese nationalism. And no matter who would be in charge of China, they would be pushed to bring those wayward areas back into China because of the history of how they left China. So the current history begins very much with Mao taking power in Tiananmen Square. And from the start, on his very first speech, he talks about ending the time of humiliation. And I guess to Westerners, I'm not sure most of us have heard about the 100 years of humiliation or what it means. Judith, you're keeping count on this. How many people have heard of the 100 years of humiliation? You see anybody? One. Well, you are in my class. Keep your hand down. 1, 2, 3. How many you got, Judith? Not many. 4. About a half dozen. Okay. And yet for the Chinese who live in China, as well as some of the Chinese who've left China, that 100 years of humiliation absolutely is in their mind. What happens is this semester I had a woman in my class who has a Chinese daughter-in-law. And the Chinese daughter-in-law was brought up here, though she lived as a young girl in Taiwan. Her father fled with Chiang Kai-shek when the communists came in. And he then came to the States and she was educated in the States. And I asked my student, could you ask your daughter-in-law to send me an email or send you an email about what does she know about the 100 years of humiliation? And here's what she says. I was brought up in a very politically aware family. My father imprinted on us the meaning of being Chinese, our history, culture, literature, and our once greatness. And the century of humiliation is a very important part of all of this. The new China rose from the ashes of this 100 years of foreign invasion, semi-colonization, utter destruction, poverty, and misery. That's how they describe the 100 years that started with the Opium Wars in 1839. It's almost imprinted into every Chinese who attends a Chinese education school. And a pretty quick way of understanding what happened to China is if you look at China's gross domestic product as a percentage of the world's gross domestic product. And there's a fellow named Angus Madison who was at Oxford and did studies of historical GDP. And he's kind of the great expert on this. And here's the numbers he came up with on China. In 1500, 25% of the world's GDP was in China. In 1700, 22%. 1820, 33%. Now watch the shift that's going to come. And remember, it's 1939 when the Opium Wars begin. 1970, 17%. 1913, 9%. 1959, 5%. So you have a country that went from being the richest, by the way, with India. India and China were the richest countries in the world. Britain and France became rich because they plundered India and China. And you have a country which was the wealthiest, very, very beautiful buildings and tremendous sense of pride and history in who they were, that went to one of the poorest in the world. And it was very quick. The descent was quick. So let's talk about where this starts and what happened. The Opium Wars went from 1839 to 1860, and it resulted in the imposition of the opium trade on China as one result. The major result was that it opened up China by eliminating the emperors of the Qing dynasty, control of the port of Canton, and the opening up of ports all along the shores of China on the Pacific Ocean. The American and French governments quickly followed suit and obtained extraterritorial rights and trading port access. The US obtained territorial concession rights in Shanghai in 1841, and in 1960 established a second concession in Tianjin. Tianjin is the port entry into Beijing. And when I was in school as a youngster about 120 years ago, I learned that America was the one trying to moderate what the Europeans were doing. And America didn't take anything from China. Actually, the Americans were occupiers and had these incredible concessions in Shanghai and Tianjin. And they were joined in this parade of land taking and grabbing of major coastal cities and trading ports by a total of 7 other nations. And the 9 nations included Great Britain, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, Japan, Portugal, Russia, and even the Soviet Union until 1924, as well as the US. By virtue of what the Chinese called a succession of unequal treaties, China became increasingly poor, as its exported goods were subject to very high tariffs and were undervalued. Its imported goods had high tariffs and were overvalued. Within a decade of the Opium Wars, China's GDP had fallen by half as the Western nations engaged in forced treaty agreements. In 1841, China ceded Hong Kong to Britain with the signing of a convention and then the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This ended the First Opium War. So Hong Kong, in the heart of China, was taken in 1842 officially, though it was amended a little later. I'll talk to that. The Treaty of Nanking allowed the British to establish 4 additional treaty ports, as well as maintain a presence in the port of Canton. Extraterritorial rights of most favored nation trade rights were given to Britain. It allowed foreign merchants to trade with anyone, abolishing the monopoly of trade imposed by the emperor under the 1760 Canton system. Outsiders had only been allowed to trade in China through the port of Canton, regulated by the emperor's appointees. Britain gained the right to send counselors to treaty ports, who then officially could deal with local officials. Trade would be subject to tariffs fixed by Britain. The Qing government paid 21 million in silver for reparations to British for their war costs in the Opium War. That's about $700 million in today's money. Hong Kong was later officially ceded to Britain in 1898 for 90 years. So where we start from is the very first Opium War. And with those first wars came the first major succeeding areas to the foreign occupying countries. And I'd like to talk about Hong Kong, and then I'll get back to the 100 years of humiliation. In 1984, as most of you can remember, the UK and China agreed that Hong Kong and its adjacent territories were to be returned to China on July 1, 2047. Okay. In the interim, Hong Kong was placed under China in a one country, two systems agreement. Hong Kong was granted a tremendous autonomy, virtually totally internal autonomy. But in foreign and defense affairs, China was in control. However, on October 1, 2019, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, when the communists took over, open protests broke out, and the demonstrations began in protest of a proposed Hong Kong extradition treaty with China. While the bill was eventually withdrawn, in the light of continuing demonstrations, the demonstrations got ever larger and became, in fact, movements for independence and democracy. Over 1 million people at one point were part of the demonstration in Tiananmen Square. China reacted to the uprising's call for independence and democracy by severely curtailing the one country, two systems arrangement. In fact, when they were finished enacting their law of the People's Republic of China on safeguarding national security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region in June of 2020, when they were finished, Hong Kong was essentially going to be part of China now. They weren't going to wait around. That act, that Security Act, criminalizes any act that encourages or supports Hong Kong's succession, any act that supports subversion, that is, undermines the power or authority of the central government. Not Hong Kong, central government. Advocates or supports actual acts of terrorism or intimidation, or involves collusion with foreign or external forces. The law allows for closed-door trials, something that had previously been unknown in Hong Kong. The law established a new security office in Hong Kong, manned by mainland Chinese and controlled by mainland Chinese. Hong Kong had to establish its own National Security Commission and enforce the laws with a Beijing-appointed advisor. By January 2021, that's this year, nearly every remaining dissident Hong Kong Legislative Council member, the governing group of Hong Kong, and its public dissidents have now been arrested. The Hong Kong uprising and the People's Republic of China reaction inevitably meant that Hong Kong was now part of China. On the face of it, the Hong Kong people can claim they're not yet part of China, but in fact, their whole security system is now Chinese controlled. And anyone who speaks up is brought to China or jailed in Hong Kong under Chinese supervision. Of course, what this has done is it's created tensions in Taiwan. And those tensions are with us and are going to stay with us for quite a while. Taiwan has a president, Tsai Ing-wen, who first won election in 2016, a parliamentary majority, it's a parliamentary system, on a platform of independence. Her platform of independence created a reaction in China, so much so, especially after the Hong Kong days, that in her 2020 re-election, there was no mention of independence. The major opposition to her party, the Democratic Progressives, the Nationalist Party, which had been Chiang Kai-shek's party, is now pushing for closer relations with China. So this is the party that fled with Chiang, is now, let's be closer with China. Let's have more ties. Taiwan, while pushing for more advanced military weaponry from the US, does not have a mutual defense treaty with the US. We have an agreement to supply Hong Kong with necessary defensive military systems. Hong Kong, on the other hand, is dependent on China. Taiwan is dependent on China economically, with 40% of its exports going to China and 20% of its imports coming from China. China's reaction to the Hong Kong independence movement and any movements toward declared independence by Taiwan flows from the history of the 100 years of oppression. Those regions, and more than almost a third of China, during the period of the 100 years of oppression, were lost to China. In the period following the Treaty of Nanking that extended that ended the First Opium War, there were a series of sporadic outbreaks of Chinese resistance, including actions by mobs against Western occupiers. These would be followed by what the Chinese termed unequal treaties and by reprisals. The most infamous of these reprisals was the destruction of the emperor's Beijing summer palace. It and its surrounding 700 acres of parks and gardens were totally destroyed. In 1860, several dozen British and French troops were killed in a hostage crisis. The British and French took vengeance by destroying the summer palace. The commander of the troops, Lord Elgin. Elgin is the same Lord Elgin of the Parthenon and Elgin statues, the friezes from Greece that were transported for their protection back to England, where they're still protected and never returned back to Greece. Lord Elgin spoke about the destruction and razing of the palace as, quote, a solemn act of retribution. The intent is to crush the emperor's pride as well as his feelings. Before the British and French had arrived in Beijing, the emperor had fled to Manchuria. The palace was plundered, its walls destroyed, and the surrounding gardens were destroyed. Everything was dug under. A member of the expeditionary force, a Colonel Wolsey, wrote, quote, the destruction of the palace was the most crushing of all blows, which could be leveled at His Majesty's inflated notion of supremacy. Reducing the parks and gardens to ruins was, quote, the strongest proof of our superior strength, and served to undeceive all Chinamen in their absurd conviction of their monarch's sovereignty. Let me show you some pictures that Judith is going to put up for you of what exactly the summer palace looked like. The first one is a picture of the summer palace in its prime. Very beautiful. Very, very beautiful. Marble, glistened. Number two, that's the pagoda and some of the surrounding gardens with the palace in the background. Number three, that's when all was said and done. The raised area that remains. And in fact, today, you can go to Beijing, and very few tourists do it, but you can ask to see the remains of the summer palace, and they're there. They're there. All right, let's return back to me. I'm not quite as pretty as the South Palace was, but I'm the one talking, so they'll see me. Okay. So it's very clear what the occupiers did. They were basically teaching the Chinese humiliation and subordination. And that happened time and time again. The last major armed Chinese attack on the occupying nations, and again, most of these attacks are mob attacks. They're not directed by the emperor. The Boxer Rebellion, the righteous and harmonious fists, occurred between 1899 and 1901. It resulted in the killing and pillagings of Christians and Christian churches, including 48 Catholic missionaries and 162 Protestant missionaries who were killed, as well as thousands of Chinese Christians being killed or maimed. It also eventually led to a siege of foreign legations in Beijing between June 20th and August 14th, 1900. This siege was listed by an expeditionary force. The force constituted 55,000 troops in total. The major components were British, American, Japanese, French, German, small contingent of Austro-Hungarian, small contingent of Italian, 13,000 Russians. And they marched from Tianjin in August and lifted the siege. The emperor fled to Manchuria again, but in 1902, after agreeing to a peace treaty that was again humiliating, they paid $333 million of that money then in reparations, and additional concession areas were established. Beginning with Great Britain's occupation of Britain in 1940 on, and only ending in 1947 with Italy's territorial occupation within Tianjin being withdrawn, China was forced to allow the occupation of its most valuable port cities by foreign powers. A total of 44 concession areas existed within China. Britain occupied 12 areas. In each concession area, the foreign power had exclusive judicial and policing rights. They were territorial, and the right of stationing their own military forces. Tianjin, a port city with access to Beijing, had the most concession areas, 8 at one time. With the United States presence in Tianjin, it was joined by Great Britain, Russia, Japan, Austria-Hungary, Italy, Germany, France, and Belgium, and all of them occupied land within the city. I had a good friend who was a Chinese scholar, spoke Mandarin and Cantonese, and published a number of books on Chinese education. And he said to me, when you go to China, and we were there several years ago, stay at the Astor Hotel in Tianjin and go to the basement and make sure you go to the city museum. So we went into the Astor Hotel, and side story, we go in and they didn't have a room for us, even though our room was booked. And what happens is the agent calls our home agent, who gets to the hotel. The guy says, have dinner on us. We had a wonderful dinner. He says, come, I'm going to show you your room. We got the room that had been occupied by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. It was just incredible. It was an amazing thing. It turned out they didn't vacuum under the bed, and we had to call them back in because it's very seldom used. MacArthur had been in that room. Hoover had been in that room. It was quite a room. But then we went down to the basement where my friend had said, go there. And in the basement of the Astor Hotels, they keep the unequal treaties. And they have a history of the unequal treaties. And that basement is a gold mine of archived materials on what was done to China. If you go to the Museum of Tianjin, it's really dedicated to the years of occupation. If you walk in Tianjin, the US Marine Corps barracks are still there. Blocks of housing and US posts are there. There's an Italian section. There's a French section. There's a German bakery. It is quite a historic living city. And that islands of preservations, those islands of preservations are kept there to this day. So if you ever go to China, one of the things I would surely recommend to you is go to Tianjin. It's an amazing place. The historic remnants of the concession areas are really maintained beautifully. It is a place to behold. So with the century of humiliation, China became one of the poorest nations on earth. When the Chinese Communist Party took over from this era of foreign occupation, internal civil wars, bandit strife, all of that ended. Mass pandemics basically came to an end. But during this era of humiliation, China, which had lost nearly a third of its territory, including Tibet, Mongolia, Hong Kong, Manchuria, Taiwan, Macau, and sizable strips along the coasts and the Yangtze River, all these lands except Taiwan now, because I'm going to say that my belief is Hong Kong is now part of China. And I don't know any possible way of reversing it, except if the Chinese communist regime were to disappear overnight, but then the succeeding democratic regime would keep its grip on Hong Kong, but maintain some sort of a democratic government there. So we have Taiwan, which was seized in 1895 by the Japanese. We have Tibet. And when Tibet was taken back by China, eventually the Dalai Lama fled. But if you read carefully about Tibet, here's what you'll find. The actual claim of Tibet as Chinese is not really contested by the Dalai Lama and his followers. What is contested is the religious rights of the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists. And the reason that it's contested is that's what China is trying to force out and place under its control. But what should be recognized is this is not unique to the Dalai Lama. The Chinese Communist Party cannot allow an alternative ideology to persist outside of the Communist Party. And so if you look at the history of religious groups with the communists in China, they're all the same as is happening with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists. The Catholic Church finally made an agreement, which it renewed this past year, that in return for allowing the Catholic faith to be exercised in China, all the bishoprics which are appointed by the Vatican must be approved by the Communist Party of China, all of them. If you look at the crackdown in Western China on the Muslims, the Uyghurs, a lot of that is associated with their intense commitment to their Muslim religion. The Protestant churches in China are basically house-based churches. And the agreement that is reached on the Protestant churches is that every single church has Communist Party surveillance within it. And every church must commit not to oppose, not to undermine, but to support the regime. And every church is monitored. So in return for local registration and surveillance, the Protestant house churches are allowed to be maintained. Well, the Chinese communists are pledging that if they choose the successor to the Dalai Lama, they too can keep their religion, as long as the Chinese Communist Party and the state of China control it. So the battle we're seeing in Tibet is a very common battle that had gone on in communist China. The Chinese people often speak of the period of greatness before the era of humiliation. And you'll often hear China's leaders speak of the dream, the return of the dream. And they're speaking about a return to the pre-occupation era, to the pre-1839 China. And Chinese Americans, many of them are well aware of this, and they understand that though the communist Chinese are clearly, I don't know if they understand it, but many Americans understand, are probably the most oppressive country in the world right now. The totalitarian control with face recognition and social credit scores is complete as one could make it probably. But China is now out of the 100 years of foreign invasions, semi-colonialization, eternal civil wars, eternal pandemics, Look at the recent pandemic. We couldn't do what the Chinese Communist Party did in Wuhan. They locked the city down, and if you were out on those streets, you were either going immediately back to your house or you were going to be arrested and dragged off. But they got the virus under control in Wuhan. And they're one of the most successful countries in containing subsequent outbreaks of the virus because they do it in the same way. It's an immediate lockdown in the society. The lessons of the century of humiliation are ever present for China's leadership, as well as its people. And we in the West do not see the world the way they see it. One of the very first things that they keep having in the forefront of their thinking is, will the West treat China and see China as equal a nation as any in the world? Remember, if you can, the history of the Chinese immigrants here. Put that on top of the 100 years of humiliation, and you get the Chinese suspicion that the West can never accept the yellow man as equal to the white man. That racism in its history is an ever-present reminder for the Chinese when they look in the mirror. The second thing, can China regain its rightful place as a major nation of the world? And here's one of the very interesting roles that China is playing right now, not seen by most Westerners. China has opened up several banks, the International Infrastructure Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure, and the Rural Development Bank. What has happened is that China has led a number of the non-Western nations in complaints that they aren't treated fairly in the major international organizations. They don't have a leadership position in the Asia Development Bank. They don't have a leadership position in the WTC, WTO. They don't have a leadership position in any of the leading international loan systems outside of China. And so China has used its growing resources to become a loan bank, funding many of the undeveloped nations' development of infrastructure. When the European nations colonized countries, they didn't build up cities in Africa, for the most part, or South America. What the European nations did was they develop a road or a railroad to connect the extraction of resources to get to the port to bring back to Europe. China doesn't do that. China has been a real leader in helping the third world nations develop infrastructure from which they could base a future economy. And China sees not only itself, but these developing nations as basically being excluded from world decision making. Now, China has a seat in the UN on the Security Council, which gives us a veto. And the last time China used its veto was over a measure that came up to condemn what's going on. I'm blocking. What's going on right now in Thailand. Thailand? No, Myanmar, in Myanmar. And China says it's not that they're supporting the dictatorship, but it is consistent with China's position that no country has the right to be involved with or try and change internal developments of another country. And by the way, that's written into many China's bilateral agreements with other nations. the right of countries to do whatever they want internally, and other countries cannot interfere. So China says, look, we're not supporting the takeover, but we are supporting the right of Myanmar to do as it wishes to do, and no country has the right to interfere with that. So it cast its veto against the condemnation. The Chinese nation, the Chinese believe, has finally almost returned to wholeness, both politically and in the integrity of its territory. Perhaps foremost in the minds of the Chinese leadership is the absolute necessity for the return of the one last piece of the homeland that has not come back, and that's Taiwan. And so the Taiwan question isn't going to go away. And how it's going to be resolved, I'm not sure of. But what I am sure of is whether it's enveloped economically or in some other fashion. It may even come to China feeling its push to launch a war and occupy Taiwan. And frankly, in that war, there's very little the US can do directly, militarily. The RAND Corporation, some other corporations, ran simulations, 17 simulations on what would happen if there were a military confrontation between China and the US over Taiwan. In the 17 simulations, China won every time. We were never successful. So the best that we could accomplish would be some sort of boycott. But I'm not sure how effective that would be, because part of China's drive is to become as economically self-sufficient as possible, because it's learned its lesson from the boycotts of Huawei and some of its other top technological dependencies from the US in semiconductors and other materials, that it had to get independence from the US. And as a result, it's becoming more self-sufficient than it ever had been, except back under the emperors when it was totally self-sufficient. So the 100 years of humiliation gives you an understanding of what's going on with Hong Kong, what's going on with Taiwan. And let me close by again repeating something. It will not matter whether it was a communist dictatorship or a democracy. China is going to claim Hong Kong. China is going to claim Taiwan. Taiwan became independent because Chiang Kai-shek fled there and was protected by the US 7th Fleet. China will not let it stand long term. So I thank you for your attention. I was told to leave about 15 minutes for questions and not to stage any kind of a filibuster in answer. So I don't know who moderates this. I think Judith, you're the moderator.
Norman has a question. He's got his hand up.
Yes, in today's world, what is the degree of trade between Taiwan and China? Is it active?
Very high. I think I gave you the figure, 40% of its exports, 20% of its imports from Taiwan to China.
So it's beneficial right now for both countries, that trade.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, my thinking had been that, and likely it would have gone even higher and higher had the current party not gotten elected. My thinking was that what China wanted to see happen was an economic envelopment of Taiwan and gradually integrate the two economies to such an extent that it would be impossible for Taiwan to live without China. And then talk with China and come to some agreement about how do we move to make it official. That's what I thought.
The reason for my question was, as long as they're trading well together and they're both benefiting, that China would not attack and try to take over Taiwan?
You're moving economically. You're being a Marxist. You know that? An economic determinist. And actually, I believe this is about ideology. And I think when and should the independence of Taiwan be moved forward aggressively, that will be the end of Taiwan's movement for period. Economics is secondary to ideology here. Next.
Mike
Yes, I
Nolan?
have an observation I'd like to make, and I appreciate your comment on it. It seems to me that China's development of the Belt and Road concept, extending throughout Asia and with the intent even to move into Africa, is a one-way street for them to expand their economy, their exports, and really develop their own alliances. Appreciate your comment on it.
I think you're making a very, very good point, but I think it's more than one way. And I'll talk to that. And actually part of the course I deal with takes a big section on this. Xi, who from the time he took office talked about and envisioned the Belt and Road creation across the globe, really. And with it, one must remember that China's economy is an export-dependent economy. The US economy is not an export-dependent economy. Though America's S&P get almost half of its profits from overseas, we're not export-dependent. They get those profits because they have manufacturing and sales overseas. China gets its profits from manufacturing at home and exporting. But what China needs is raw materials. And what China needs are markets for its exports. It is the largest export country in the world. And that's where Belt and Road comes into play. The other place it comes into play, no doubt, is creating economic and strategic alliances. So let me give you one that Americans don't really appreciate. Greece, for example, 15% of its GDP is based from China. China owns the port of Piraeus in Greece. And that port is a major development for Greece and is one of the few things that have helped stabilize its economy. It has extended its port areas around Europe. And we have one with Israel. China has one with Israel now. And the US is furious at this, concerned about its fleet and docking and supplies. So Belt and Road creates a China that's very different. When we had our antagonism with the Soviet Union and the Cold War, we had the very famous Iron Curtain come down and America's encirclement of Russia, because Russia was basically a closed economy. They weren't a trading nation. They weren't a nation with bases and ports overseas. We closed them in. We can't do that to China. And China's development of Belt and Road accelerates China's independence from being closed in. So yeah, it's a very important thing. It is quite an undertaking for China. And its results have not been very positive for the US, I think.
Mike Nolan, I think you had your hand up next. Do you want to unmute yourself? You have to unmute. Okay.
Okay, yeah. There's a theory, and apparently largely borne out by some evidence that as capitalism increases, that it somehow goes hand in glove with democracy. And I think there was some expectation. I remember someone saying when China took over and I mean in 1997, in that sense, took over politically Hong Kong, that it wouldn't be that China would change Hong Kong, but the other way around. But recently, that doesn't seem to be borne out. And I realize maybe this isn't enough time to really make a statement. But do you think that China's clearly, I know the party's called the Communist Party, but it's a capitalist society. Do you think that they will become a democracy eventually?
No, that's a short answer.
Okay.
let me go to some of the statements you made in there, because
Okay.
I think they are statements that a lot of people believed and still believe. First of all, the association of capitalism with democracy. Neither Pinochet's Chile nor Salazar's Portugal bear that out.
Oh, good point.
And what happened in China was when Deng took power in a collegial government, which was a couple of years after the death of Mao in 78, Deng decentralized, Deng privatized, Deng created a capitalist private enterprise system that is still the source of most of the profits, most of the innovation within China. Okay? However, Tiananmen Square came on in 1989. Remember that? And Tiananmen Square is the great setback for China. Because what happened was all those people in Tiananmen Square, the Chinese leadership as a group had a series of meetings, and the records of those meetings actually were smuggled out. And during those meetings, they came to the conclusion that they had to stamp out this democracy movement. And thus the troops and the police with live ammunition came into the square, killed thousands, jailed thousands. We don't know the numbers, the exact numbers. But in the wake of Tiananmen, China closed down its internet and media access beyond China for the average Chinese. In addition, when Xi came in, Xi did several things beyond Belt and Road that have fundamentally altered China. I argue there were three major regimes in China. We start with Mao in 49, and he ends and dies with the Cultural Revolution going on that just destroyed China internally. Destroyed its education, destroyed everything going in there that was progress. Then comes in, creates another regime. Xi comes in, and here's what Xi does. He basically agrees the party has become corrupt and the economic entities have become corrupt, which was true. But he uses a corruption campaign, an anti-corruption campaign, to do several things. He locks up over 1 million people, brought into court through charges, knocks off his major opposition within the Communist Party leadership, and clamps down controls that have been extended even further on both the state-owned enterprises and private enterprise. There is now a policy statement within China that all private enterprises have to be consistent with state needs. There was a study done of the 100 largest private enterprises in China. 95 of them have former leading communist officials as their head. State-owned enterprises are directly have a Communist Party state management committee on the side of each of them. China has become, I thought it was going to become this great capitalist. You walk in China, you walk in the main cities. It's an amazing thing to see the Western stores, the Chinese stores, the incredible sight. You could be in any major city when you're in Shanghai, except for the ambiance. And Hong Kong, well, that was always different. Let's leave it aside. You could be in any major city, and you think you were in a capitalist enclave, but you're not. You're in an enclave that's controlled by the Communist Party. It is more centrally controlled both economically and politically than it has ever been. And that's Xi. Xi has directed the creation of this monolith state. And it's not going away. And part of what prompted me to start to investigate this more was I had an economics major when I was an undergraduate, and my graduate studies involved a lot of mathematics and economics. And I'd always been taught that the top-down economies are very rigid. It's what Schumpeter called thumbs versus fingers. Top-down economies are thumbs. But the Chinese thumb economy is thriving. It's done better than any other major economy, both in coming out of and not even being affected by the 2008, 2009 recession. And in this recession, it went down for a bit, but it has come out and is the only major economy in positive territory for the GDP. I think the era of high technology, computerization, number crunching has allowed a top-down economy to thrive much better than was ever possible 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. By the way, one of the verifications of this notion is look at the international corporate structures and how a company that's based in New York City can have control of an empire across the globe. And the same in Norway. Computerization allows minute control. And it is a control which the Chinese have availed themselves of very successfully, I think, at this point. How's that strike you, Mike?
I'm still thinking about it. You seem to be saying that, you know, that's one thing that strikes me is that I had the impression that modern technology, you know, the social media and everything, was actually a democratizing influence, but you're saying just the opposite.
It allows more
and
control.
You might be right. I don't know. It's I have to mull this over. Every time I try to get an answer to a question, I get more questions come up.
Well, yeah, it's a disturbing answer. But you know, Chinese people are walled off from the rest of the world, essentially. On the other hand, China has 300,000 students in America. They do allow that exit. They have millions of tourists go out. They're not afraid of that. But once they get back into China, it's a closed information system. Absolutely closed. We have another minute or two.
Next is Steve had his hand up first, and so let's go with Steve Vransky.
Yeah, hi. It's a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I've noticed just in the last few weeks that China has been sending fighter planes into the airspace of Taiwan. And I don't know if this is just a signal of what the future is going to be, but it seems that this is one of the, you know, they've just started to do this in the last few weeks. I've noticed it going on to some of the foreign newspapers and stuff that I'm reading. And the other thing is that China has about 90% of the rare earths that we need for operation of our computers, our cell phones, for our airplanes, for our missiles, for everything. I mean, without the rare earths, our society crumbles. And I've also noticed when I was in South America a couple of years ago that China had gone in and bought a huge mine of some rare earths. And it seems like they're going throughout the world and purchasing these mines and other rare earths. So what is the future? How do we protect ourselves if they're going to control all the rare earths? They're not rare, but they're hard to mine.
When you say that, what is the future? I charge $10,000 per hour on that discussion. And then you don't really get an answer anyway. The fact is that China is a major, it was recognized. There was a report put out by a bipartisan committee whose co-chairs were appointed by Pelosi and McConnell. And their conclusion was America's biggest single competitor and threat is China now. So it's not just Trump who spoke this way, it's now integrated through. There were 15 flights, overflights that weekend by the Chinese, including fighter jets and bombers. And the Chinese are very concerned about, do things change for the better under Biden, or are we going to be in the same path? And I don't think anyone knows what the path is out of this. I think Taiwan is a deadly, deadly embrace if China and us get involved in a contentious fashion. Deadly. And a no-win for us. Possibly a no-win for China too. But it's a terrible place for these things to happen. As for South America, yes, you're quite correct. If you go on and you look up BRI.com, I think is their net location. B is in Belt, Road, I.com. It's Belt and Road Initiative.com. If you go online, you can see how much of Africa and South America has been penetrated by the Chinese Belt and Road Project. That's the major places, as well as Southeast Asia. What China wants is trade route connectivity. And that's what Belt and Road gives them. Plus, China needs minerals. And if you go on and look up on Google, Google's fabulous. If you look up on Google, critical materials imported from China, critical materials, percentage mined by each nation, top 10. You're going to see a spectacular display of Chinese critical material ownership. It's simply a reality. It is simply a reality. My hope is that we create a modus vivendi between the US and China. There is no doubt in my mind, now this is just me, that if I were in charge, and again, I tell Biden, you can have me, and for you, I'll give a better price, $5,000 an hour. I won't be like Giuliani and overcharge. What I would advise is allow areas of control, areas of provenance. And so China, while allowing free passage through the South China Sea, guaranteeing it with the US, would make sure those Straits of Malacca are open and the US would be allowed to go in. And would have essentially an area like we have in the Western Hemisphere, an area of local control. The contentiousness is not about China's expanding militarily overseas. The only major overseas base it has is in Djibouti, off the tip of Africa, which is about, again, trading and oil lanes. China is heavily dependent on external oil, and Australia for coal. So I think that's the live and let live possibility. But to try and contest China across the globe, it just doesn't work. Won't work for us, won't work for them. The idea of spheres of influence, that I think can occur and be livable with. But in return for doing that, you're conceding something. The US is. The US is the dominant economic, military, political, and soft power, meaning social power in the world. Will it be willing to give equality to China in its backyard and essentially say, okay, just like we have the Western Hemisphere, you have your South China Sea area, but it's not to be militarized, and we're always allowed to pass as are any other country. That I think we can live with, but I'm not sure that a US government is willing to do that.
So we have one more question, and that will have to be that for today. Gary, if you want to go ahead and share your question.
Okay, thank you, Mark. It was good to hear from you again, and look
Hello there,
forward.
Gary.
Yeah, hi. Look forward to your in-person classes, hopefully next year or sooner. So you partially spoke about this in the last answer, but how do you think the Biden administration will differ from the Trump administration as relations with China?
I don't know. I really don't know. And I think the Biden people themselves are trying to figure it out. I'm not in those talks, obviously. But this is one of the great ambiguities. You know, there was a book by Graham Allison on what was called the Thucydides trap, where in the last thousands of years, the Harvard group under Allison did a study of the 16 times when a rising power was confronted by the reigning power. Of those 16 times, 13 times there was war. The easiest for you to remember is the rise of Germany and Britain contesting. The Soviet Union was one of the few times when there wasn't a major war. The US policy of containment that Kennan had developed really worked. We avoided a major war, but that's rare. 13 out of 16 resulted in war. That is the great, great threat that the dominant power does not know to give way. By the way, another case which you again may not know is back in the 19th century, when Britain was the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere over Venezuela and other places. The US and Britain knocked heads. And it wasn't until late in the 1800s that the British came to the conclusion that the US was now the dominant power. And we were going to go for a modus vivendi with the US. And they did. They did. Britain turned its attention to Germany. And the US and Britain subsequently became partners. And now the US is, of course, the dominant regime by far. So there have been instances of war averted, like between the US and Britain, like between the US and Russia. In the US and Britain, it was the US ascending. By the way, that actually comes from the Peloponnesian War, where Sparta had Athens coming up. And thus, as Thucydides said, this created the war. And he was right. Sparta's fear of Athens. So I thank you, everyone. Did I hear one last? No, Harvey, don't clap yet. One last one? No, say no. Good. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure seeing you long distance.
My great wall.
Thank you. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you,
Mark.
you.
I
My great
appreciate
wall.
your.
It was great.
Oh,
Great talk.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mark. It was a wonderful presentation, and we'll see you all another time.
You're welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.